Okay, well, hi everyone. My name is Sam Povey. I'm an educator that works for the WSET School London, and I am pleased to be joined this evening by Emma Symington MW, who is the Education Development Manager for Wine Australia. We've been running a series of tastings for quite a while now, Emma, haven't we?
Yeah, it's been a quite a while. Yeah.
Or a series of webinars, I should say, looking at the different wine regions of Australia. And today we're heading over to the West. So I'm going to hand over to Emma in a moment, but just a quick reminder, if you have any questions at all during the webinar, please put them in the Q&A box. So don't put them in the chat, but put them in the Q&A box. And we will answer them, Emma will answer them as we go. So without further ado, Emma, I will hand over to yourself and everyone enjoy the webinar.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Sam. And hello, everyone. Yeah, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. So yeah, I'm really thrilled to be doing another of these Discover Australia webinars with WSET School London. And as Sam said, today we're focusing on two regions in Western Australia, being Margaret River and Great Southern. So just quickly, to introduce myself, I'm Emma Symington. As Sam said, I'm a Master of Wine and I work for Wine Australia, so the generic body for Australian wine. And just to quickly point out our education website, which is on the screen in front of you, australianwinediscovered.com, because particularly if you're studying for your WSET exams or really any other wine exams, it is your one-stop shop for anything you could want to learn about Australian wine. We have 28 modules on there now. That is covering all of the key regions in Australia, the key grape varieties, and then there's broader topics. There's one on sparkling wine, there's one on old vines, there's one on organics, and so on. And then within each module, you have a study guide. There's a PowerPoint presentation you can download and use as you see fit. There's videos, there's all the maps, of course, are on there, and there's quizzes available too. So really a huge amount of information there. You do have to register to use the website, but once you've done that, everything is available for free download, as I said, to use as you see fit. So really worth taking a note of that, particularly if you are studying for your WSET exams. So today, what we're looking at is, as I said, two regions in Western Australia, Margaret River and Great Southern. For each, I'll give you a bit of information on their geography, so where they are, their climate, and of course their soil types, and then we'll discuss their prominent grape varieties within each region. So in Australia, there are 65 wine regions, as you can see, predominantly down in the southeastern corner of the country, but we're focusing right across in the western part of Australia. And probably just worth underlining how big Australia is, because if you head from Sydney over in New South Wales across to Perth in Western Australia, that's a 5-hour flight. It's about 2,000 miles and you'll be crossing 3 time zones. So interestingly, Perth is actually closer to Jakarta in Indonesia than it is to Sydney. So when you go across to Western Australia, it does feel very separate to the rest of, all of the wine regions over in the southeastern part of Australia. So it really is quite a different world of winemaking, if you like. So Western Australia has 9 official wine regions, as you can see here. And today, as I said, we're focusing on 2 of them, Margaret River and Great Southern. And these are really the 2 that we see most regularly in the export markets. The others occasionally you'll see, but they're tend to be much smaller in terms of production. So we're focusing on these 2 main ones. So kicking off with Margaret River, which is probably Western Australia's most famous or most celebrated wine region. It's about a 3-hour drive south of Perth and is quite often referred to as being the most isolated wine region in the world. And as I said, it's really now Western Australia's most celebrated wine region. There's a lot of really, really high quality, very premium wine coming out of Margaret River. But interestingly, it's actually a pretty young wine region, particularly on a global scale. The first plantings were back in 1967, so it's 55, 57 years old now, so pretty young in terms of its history. So just quickly on a bit of history before we talk about the region in some more detail. So as a region, it was first settled back in the 1830s, originally as a farming area, particularly for dairy farming and also for timber. And it wasn't until, as I said, really towards the end of the 20th century that viticulture began to kick off in the region. And that was the result of some research that happened. Firstly, as you can see, in 1955 by Howard Olmo, who did some research right across southwestern Australia, looking at potential regions to start viticulture, start planting vineyards. But then the important piece of research was in 1965. And this was a researcher called Dr. John Gladstones. He was based at the University of Western Australia in Perth, and he was tasked by the Western Australian government to go and sort of look at potential areas within Western Australia that might be suited to viticulture. And when he was looking at Margaret River, he said that the climate in Margaret River was very similar to a warm vintage in Bordeaux. Now, remembering this was 1965, so a warm vintage in Bordeaux then is probably a fairly standard average vintage in Bordeaux today. And he also said that the soil type in Margaret River was lots of very free draining gravelly soils. And he sort of compared that to the left bank of Bordeaux. So again, those free draining gravelly soils. So because of that, he suggested that people started planting Bordeaux grape varieties. And that's really what happened, and pretty quickly. As you can see, in 1967, so just 2 years after this research happened, the first vineyards were planted in Margaret River, and that was by Dr. Tom Cullity at Bass Felix. And he really started off by planting Cabernet Sauvignon and Malbec, so those Bordeaux red grape varieties. The Chardonnay followed not too long after, in 1976. The first plantings of Chardonnay were at Lewin Estate. And that was really because they were working with Robert Mondavi, so of Napa fame. He was their consultant at the time, and he suggested they started planting Chardonnay. As I said, that happened in 1976, and other wineries followed. And really, Lewin Estate kind of very quickly got a huge amount of international acclaim, because their second vintage of their Art Series Chardonnay, which was the 1981 vintage, so thinking those vines were planted in 1976, these were 5-year-old vines. So that second vintage that ever made of this wine was named the best Chardonnay in the world by Decanter magazine. So you can imagine what a coup this was for Margaret River, but what sort of waves it sent around the world of wine, and suddenly made everyone sit up and take notice and think about or hear about, perhaps for the first time, Margaret River. And that award from Lewin Estate with their Chardonnay was followed quite quickly by a number of awards for Cabernet Sauvignon, and particularly with Kate Mentel, but other people as well were getting trophies and so on at the time. So throughout the 80s and then through the 90s, there was a lot of interest in Margaret River because of these really high-end, very high-quality premium wines. As you can see, the geographic indication, that's the regional designation that we use in Australia, so very similar to the AC that you'll use across Europe. So the GI of Margaret River was registered in 1996, so at that point it became an official wine region. And today there's just under 5,000 hectares of vineyard within the region, and about 150 wineries. So looking at the region in a bit more detail, and this is a topographical map that we've created using remote satellite imaging software. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of the topography of the region, but it also shows you exactly where the vineyards are. And that is these dark green blobs that you can see on the map. So as I said, there's just under about 5,000 hectares of vineyards across Margaret River, predominantly towards the north, as you can see, but they really do spread right down the peninsula. Now, Margaret River is a peninsula, as you can see. It's surrounded on 3 sides by the ocean. So really, the ocean is such an important part of Margaret River's identity, its personality, and really gives the wines in Margaret River their particular style. Now, if you've done any of my other webinars where I've been talking about Australian wine regions, you've probably heard me talk about the Southern Ocean. So the Southern Ocean is a really cold ocean that sits right across the southern part of Australia. All of the waters come up from Antarctica, and it has a really important moderating influence right across the southern seaboard of Australia, particularly any wine regions that are near the coast or near the south coast of Australia, have this real moderating influence from that cold Southern Ocean. So in Margaret River, the southern part of Margaret River absolutely is that cold Southern Ocean, so having that really cooling, moderating influence. But the interesting thing about Margaret River is that the northern side and the western side is actually the Indian Ocean, so a different ocean. So Margaret River is the sort of confluence of these two oceans, and the Indian Ocean is very different because it's a warm ocean. So you've got the cold waters down in the Southern Ocean, and you've got those warmer waters in the Indian Ocean. And really that acts to have quite a low diurnal variation in Margaret River. So it never gets too hot in the daytime in Margaret River. On a sunny summer's day, it might be 30 degrees, not a huge amount more than that. But in the winter, again, it doesn't drop too cold. So the Indian Ocean has this lovely moderating ability, and it means there's very low frost risk in Margaret River. You don't ever get any frost in Margaret River because of this influence of this warmer ocean. So this makes the northern part of Margaret River very much warmer than the southern part. So classically, you're going to have the red grapes planted more towards the northern part of Margaret River, and the white grapes particularly planted more towards the southern part of Margaret River. Now, the other thing that's worth talking about when it comes to the ocean is a particular current that runs down the coastline of Margaret River, which is called the Lewin Current. Now, this runs from the north to the south. So this is pulling that warm Indian Ocean water right down that coastline of Margaret River. Now, in the winter, this current runs pretty close to the coast, so pulling that warm water right down towards the southern part of Margaret River. And as I said, moderating that climate throughout the winter, lowering that issue of that risk of frost and creating this lovely balmy kind of winter temperatures. In the summer, however, that current pushes out to the west. That's really to do with the trade winds that are blowing through the summer. So that current pushes out to the west, which allows this cold Southern Ocean water to push much further north up the coastline of Margaret River. And then what you have throughout the summer is this prevailing southwesterly breeze. So a wind that comes from the southwest, so off that cold Southern Ocean, picking up all that cold air off the ocean and pushing it onto Margaret River. And they refer to this as the Fremantle Doctor in Margaret River. And it happens so regularly, really in the afternoon in the summertime, that the locals refer to it as the natural air conditioner, because it's such an important wind, such an important cooling, moderating influence that runs throughout the summer, cooling that temperature in the vineyards, you know, around the grapes, and keeping all that lovely freshness, acidity, elegance in the resulting wine. And again, this is one of those reasons you get this particular style of wine in Margaret River, which to my mind is always beautifully poised and elegant with this beautiful acidity running through it. And that is in part because of this, this breeze, this lovely cooling afternoon breeze that runs in the summer. It also, of course, has an important influence because it absolutely decreases risk of diseases throughout the vineyards. So there's very low disease pressure in Margaret River. So all of that together means the overall climate in Margaret River is Mediterranean, but with this strong maritime influence. So this ocean influence is really impacting the climate in Margaret River, but typically Mediterranean, and that, you know, warm summers, dry summers, but much cooler and very much wetter winters. They tend to get quite a lot of stormy weather throughout the winters, dumping a lot of rain. So it's actually in total, there's a lot more rain in Margaret River than we see here in London. It's just in London, it's sort of spread throughout the year. In Margaret River, it falls really in the winter and much, much drier through the summer. So just a few images to give you an idea of what Margaret River looks like as a region, and it is stunningly beautiful. You know, obviously you've got this amazing coastline running right around the region. And because you're at these confluence of these two oceans, it's a region where you get a lot of big swells, big waves, It's a region where surfing, is one of the key regions in the world to go surfing. So you often find if you're over there, the winemakers, if they're not in the winery, they're probably out surfing. That ocean influence, again, really playing a part in the identity of the region. So just a lovely image and giving you an idea of what Margaret River looks, a nice drone image. And the thing to point out here are these huge stands you can see of forest. So Margaret River is about 46% indigenous vegetation, so remnant vegetation in the region. It's a biodiversity hotspot because of that, and that I'm talking on a global scale, incredible biodiversity hotspot. And you have these huge stands of these big eucalyptus trees, very tall Mari, Carry, and Jarrah trees, which again is a really important part of Margaret River's identity and what it looks like when you go there. Now, when it comes to soil in Margaret River, I mentioned at the beginning that the research Dr. John Gladstone's did, and one of the reasons he suggested planting Bordeaux grape varieties in Margaret River was because of this very gravelly, very free-draining soil. And that absolutely is the predominant soil type in Margaret River. Iron-rich, ironstone-rich, gravelly, lateritic gravel, they refer to it there, often over a base of clay. So this is very free draining, low in nutrients, the gravelly soils, but over a base of clay. So that actually has some water holding capacity, which helps the vineyards through these long, dry summers. And the other point to talk about when it comes to Margaret River and soils is that these are some of the most ancient vineyard soils in the world, 1.6 billion years old, or something totally ridiculous. Really, really incredibly old vineyard soils. And when it comes to viticulture, Western Australia, the entirety of the state is phylloxera free. So the vast majority of the vineyards in Margaret River are planted on their own roots because there's never been any need to plant on grafted rootstock. So that is the typical planting in Margaret River, will be on its own roots. And then when it comes to grape growing in Margaret River, as I said, because of these lovely winds that you get coming through the summers, the risk of pests and disease are very low. In fact, the only thing that's real can be a problem in Margaret River are birds eating the grapes just before they ripen. This is particularly a problem in years where the eucalyptus trees have very low blossoms. So in years when there's a lot of blossom around, the birds go and eat that instead. But in years when there's very low blossom, they can come and eat the grapes. So netting of the vineyards can be very important in Margaret River. But otherwise, pests and disease risks are very low. And what that means is it's a region where organics, biodynamics, working sustainably is really front of mind for most growers within the region. And it's one of those regions in Australia where organics and biodynamics are really sort of at the forefront. And then when it comes to grape growing, the thing that's really worthwhile getting a little bit geeky about with Margaret River is talking about clones. Because as it says here, Margaret River has two very important heritage clones, one for Chardonnay and one for Cabernet Sauvignon. So I'll just talk to you about that in a little bit more detail because I think it's one of the things that's worth understanding because it really explains why Margaret River Chardonnay tastes like it does and why Margaret River Cabernet Sauvignon tastes like it does. So coming first to Chardonnay, and the heritage clone of Chardonnay in Margaret River is this Gin clone. Now, for a long time, people thought Gin was the same clone as Mendoza. But in fact, research back in 2018 showed that these two clones are as different from each other as they are from any other clone of Chardonnay. But what they share is this tendency to millerandage or hen and chicken, which is what you can see here. So hen and chicken refers to when you have one bunch of grapes, but very, very different sizes of grapes on the same bunch. And that's a result of poor fruit set usually. So as I hope you can see on this photo, on this image, you've got some absolutely tiny grapes. So these are, have a high skin to juice ratio and are very high in acidity. And then you also have these huge, sort of almost marble-sized berries, and these have a lot of intensity and concentration and juiciness. And together, this is what gives Margaret River Chardonnay its particular style, because Margaret River Chardonnay always has this lovely intensity and concentration of fruit, but then this absolute seam of acidity running through it, and then this texture. And the texture for me is the key sort of thing I can point out and pick out, making it Margaret River Chardonnay. And the reason you have this texture in Margaret River Chardonnay is because of these tiny berries. So as I said, they have a very high skin to juice ratio, which means you're getting a lot more phenolics out of those berries during winemaking. And this is what's giving that texture in the wine, that slight phenolic content. Now, just to explain that a bit more, Virginia Wilcox, she's the winemaker at Vas Felix in Margaret River. She's got a lovely way of sort of talking about this texture in Margaret River, because she refers to it as being al dente. So if you think about, when you bite into a piece of really well-cooked pasta that is properly al dente, it's that slight bite, that slight crunch, and that slight grip around the palate. And that's exactly the same sort of thing that you find in Margaret River Chardonnay. And it's coming specifically from this particular clone of Chardonnay called Gingin. So this was the first clone planted in Margaret River by Lewin Estate back in 75. And it really is the most widely planted clone of Chardonnay in Margaret River. Now, there are some other clones planted as well, particularly some Dijon clones. But really, when you go and taste through, all the top end, high end premium Chardonnay, it really all is Gingin clone, because the winemakers have realized how special this clone is to the region, how well suited it is, how, what's the word I want? It ripens much, sort of a much gentler rate than perhaps some of the Dijon clones do. So it's keeping all that lovely acidity and freshness and juiciness in the grapes. And it just is a clone that is so well suited to the region. So worth knowing a little bit about, and because it does begin to explain why Margaret River Chardonnay tastes the way it does. And then for Cabernet Sauvignon, again, there is this important heritage clone, which is called the Halton clone. This again was one of those first clones planted in Margaret River back in the 1960s. It was the first clone planted by the likes of Vas Felix, Cullen, Mosswood, and so on. And then actually between the 1970s and 1990s, plantings of this clone decreased, and people started instead planting a clone from South Australia called SA126. That clone had the benefit of being higher yielding, tends to be a bit lighter and more herbaceous characters. But more recently, and particularly in the last sort of 25, 30 years, winemakers have really realized how important and how special the Halton clone is, because as a clone, it's low in vigor, low yielding with very, very small berries, and it has this amazing aromatic complexity. So where that South Australian clone that they had in the ground for a while tended to give quite a lot of herbaceous characters, those slightly green notes, the Halton clone instead is much more about cassis and blackcurrant and these really pure primary fruit flavors. And then these lovely fine-grained tannins from those very, very small berries. And again, a bit like Gingin clone Chardonnay, all of really the top Cabernet Sauvignon coming out of Margaret River now is really based on the Halton clone, because again, growers and winemakers have realized how special this is to the region and how it gives Margaret River Cabernet that particular style, which is very different to styles of Cabernet coming out of the likes of Coonawarra or Barossa or McLaren Vale, any of those regions across in South Australia making Cabernet. Margaret River Cabernet tends to be, as I said, that much more aromatic, beautiful intensity, lovely fine-grained tannins, and all about power and elegance. And that is what Halton clone gives it. So overall, this is just a snapshot of the top 5 varieties in Margaret River. Cabernet Sauvignon being the #1 red grape variety, often blended, as I've said, with other Bordeaux grape varieties, a bit of Merlot, a bit of Malbec, Petit Verdot, for example. Shiraz, on the other hand, is the #1 grape variety across the entirety of Australia, sorry, but only 12% of plantings in Margaret River. Although I would say it's a variety really to watch in Margaret River. That I've tried recently some absolutely beautiful Shiraz coming out of Margaret River, which have that kind of lovely vibrance and fruitiness of Shiraz, but blended with this lovely kind of more almost savory notes coming through there as well. So a slightly more restrained style of Shiraz, and really worth seeking out from Margaret River. Then for the white grapes, Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon are the two key ones, and often blended together, either as Sauvignon Blanc dominant blends or Semillon dominant blends, and that really is a winemaking decision as to which one is the most important. And again, this is about that sort of link in terms of climate and soils to Bordeaux. This is why these varieties were first planted in Margaret River. And then, of course, Chardonnay probably being the most widely thought about, most highly thought about white grape variety in Margaret River, and some, as I've said, absolutely stunning Chardonnays coming out of Margaret River. And I would argue very much, at that top level on the global stage, incredible wines. Right, before I move on to Great Southern, I can see there's just been a question come through. Can I compare Napa, Bordeaux, and Margaret River Cabernet Sauvignon wines with each other's similarities and differences? Oh, great question. So typically, I would say Bordeaux probably will have a little bit more of that savoury, perhaps slightly herbaceous tone, more of those kind of cedary spice tones coming through. Napa, often to my mind, has a little bit more weight, a little bit more glycerol, so that kind of body and mouthfeel. And perhaps not quite as much freshness and acidity as you'll have in Margaret River. As I said, to my mind, Margaret River, Cabernet Sauvignon is all about that lovely, beautiful, lifted aromatics, pure cassis kind of fruit, and then these fine-grained tannins with that seam of acidity running through it. So, it'd be a fascinating thing sometime if you get the chance to do a blind tasting of a Margaret River Cabernet, a Bordeaux, and a Napa, because I think you'll see significant differences between the three, and then you can decide which style you prefer. Okay, so moving on to our second wine region, which is Great Southern. So where Margaret River was about 3 hours drive south of Perth, here we're southeast of Perth, and it's a 4 to 5 hour drive. So again, a fair way, a fairly long way from anywhere. It's a pretty huge region in terms of area, as you get an idea from this little map, and it has got these 5 official sub-regions within it. Now, looking at the history of Great Southern, and actually there's a lot of similarities in the history compared to what I just talked about with Margaret River. So again, there was this research back in 55 looking at the potential for different parts of Western Australia for viticulture. At that point, Howard Olmo talked about Great Southern and suggested it might be a good region, and the first commercial vineyard was planted in 1965 near Mount Barker, which is one of those more central of the current sub-regions. I think through those early years, through the 60s, 70s, and through the 80s, it was all pretty small in terms of production. I mean, it's pretty small to this day, but in those early years, it was really quite small, very much family-owned production. Again, we had the GI created in 1996, so the same year as in Margaret River, and that was quite quickly followed by these official sub-regions, with Mount Barker being the first in 1997, followed then by Parongarup, Albany, Franklin River, and finally Denmark in 2003. So today there's just under 3,000 hectares of vineyard area in Great Southern, which is not very much considering the huge size of it in terms of its area. So here again is our little topographical and remote satellite imaging map. And this, I hope, really gives you an idea of just how little there is in terms of viticulture and vineyard plantings in this huge expanse of Great Southern. So just to put a bit of scale on here, it's about 160 kilometres from the north to the south of Great Southern, and about 250 kilometres from east to west. So in total, it's covering 1.7 million hectares of land area in the entirety of Great Southern. So it is by far and away the largest wine region in Australia. So unsurprising that it's been kind of subdivided into these official sub-regions, as you can see here. And the sub-regions really are quite different to each other in terms of their climate, in terms of their topography, and in terms of what grape varieties are planted there. So on the coast, we've got these two coastal sub-regions of Denmark and Albany. Now, in terms of plantings, these are both really pretty small, less than 100 hectares each. They're on the coast, and this again is that cold Southern Ocean I've been talking about. So this is very much cool, maritime influenced climate. And these are both regions which really have that cool maritime influence in terms of the varieties that are planted there. So Chardonnay and Pinot Noir are probably the major varieties for both regions. And that's made not only for still wine, but also for sparkling wine. So again, that should give you an idea of just how cool these parts of Great Southern are. Then as you move inland, up into Mount Barker and Parongarup, so still some sort of coastal influence there, some maritime influence, a little bit further inland though. Parongarup particularly, you're getting a little bit of altitude there. It has these huge granite boulders, really quite a stunningly beautiful region. And both of these two sub-regions, Mount Barker and Parongarup, are very well known for Riesling. So this is really where Riesling is king. There's also a bit of Syrah across in Mount Barker. And then as you head further inland up into Franklin River, this is, as you can see, the most inland of these sub-regions. So it is the warmest, although overall, Great Southern being a cool climate region. So it's the warmest part of a cool climate region, and a little bit more continental in terms of its climate. And this is really where Syrah is king. So Franklin River, as you can probably pick out from this map, is the most planted of all of these sub-regions. Almost half of all plantings in Great Southern are in Franklin River. So really is the most important sub-region. And as I said, Syrah is the most planted grape variety there, but made very much in this restrained, savoury, earthy style, quite different from Shiraz, from the likes of Barossa or McLaren Vale over in South Australia. So quite often you find that wines in Franklin River will be labelled as Syrah rather than Shiraz, just to give you that indication of the style coming out of the region. So again, just a few images to give you an idea of what Great Southern looks like. And I've talked about the coast, and it is that cold Southern Ocean, and it is stunningly beautiful, this part of Great Southern. Some amazing, as you can see here, just beautiful beaches. And in fact, for the last few years, I think the beach that's been voted the best beach in Australia, in the entirety of Australia, is in Great Southern. So really stunning coastal scenery. Then as you move further inland, as I said, up in Parongarup, so you've got these big granite boulders, and this image is just giving you an idea of what some of that looks like. And then further inland again, this is up in Franklin River. So here we actually have a bit of altitude. Franklin River is sitting at about 350 meters. So further inland, but a bit of altitude, which again has that cooling influence, but it's kind of more of a plateau landscape, as you can see here, so flatter. And these, really broad views. So hopefully those three images give you an idea of just how scenically diverse Great Southern is, which again goes to underline, I think, some of the different styles of wines coming out of Great Southern. So altogether, climate, as it says, is broadly Mediterranean, but really when you're talking about a region as big as Great Southern with so many different sub-regions, you can't kind of really do broad brushstrokes, because those coastal regions, sub-regions of Denmark and Albany are very, very much cooler because of that ocean influence. And then as you move inland, as I said, it does get more continental and slightly warmer in terms of climate. So really quite diverse across the region. And then, unsurprisingly, when it comes to soil types, again, I think the key word here is diversity. So you do have some of these lateritic gravelly soils, so very similar to what you see in Margaret River. But then there's also more sandy soils, there's more loamy soils, there's also clay soils. So it really is this patchwork of different soil types across this vast region, which again sort of gives interest and certainly complexity to the region. And it's something I think growers and winemakers are really only beginning to sort of understand now. You know, it's a young region. People haven't been planting vineyards here for very long. And so people are only really beginning to understand what the different soil types means for the different varieties in the region and to the ultimate wine styles. So it's a fascinating and sort of fast-moving story as people learn more and more about these soil types and what, you know, what's under the ground in Great Southern. So grape growing in Great Southern. So when it comes to a region, as I've said, which is quite diverse in terms of its climate, in terms of its topography, and in terms of its soil types, unsurprisingly, there is a number of different grape varieties planted in Great Southern. The key ones, or the hero grape varieties, if you like, for the region are really Syrah and Riesling. But there's a lot of so-called alternative grape varieties planted there too. And of course, as I said, you know, Chardonnay and Riesling and all sorts of other things too. So all sorts of things happening in Great Southern. So then just a snapshot of the top 5 varieties. And I think the interesting thing on this slide is I just said Riesling is the hero white grape variety, but actually it doesn't exist or doesn't show in these top 5 varieties. So Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay and Semillon being more important in terms of plantings, even though I think many of us would associate Great Southern far more with Riesling. And that's perhaps in part because the style of Riesling coming out of Great Southern is quite different to the more classic regions of, say, Eden Valley and Clare Valley, which tend to be a bit tauter in terms of acidity and more those lemon, lime, citrus kind of notes. In Great Southern, the Riesling there tends to be a bit more mineral and a bit more floral. So I always get this lovely lifted aromatic perfume coming off of Great Southern Riesling and slightly broader acidity than you get in some of those South Australian regions. So again, a lovely style to compare to some of those more classic regions and a really beautiful style of Riesling. Then, as I said, Syrah or Shiraz really is the hero red grape variety in Great Southern. As you can see, nearly 30% of all plantings. And that shouldn't really be a surprise because, as I've said, Franklin River is by far and away the most planted of the sub-regions of Great Southern. And that is that warmer, more continental climate sub-region where Shiraz really is king. So this is why when you look at the overall figures, Shiraz is so important in Great Southern. But as I touched on earlier, you know, it's not made in that big, bold, intense, concentrated style of Shiraz. It's made much more in that restrained, savoury, slightly more structured, perhaps more earthy style of Syrah. And there's some really, really beautiful wines coming out of Great Southern. Right, I think that's kind of everything I wanted to cover for Great Southern. Let's have a look if anyone's got any questions. Alex, what has been the past current trend for oak use in Margaret River wines? Good question. I'm going to guess you're perhaps talking more about white wine than red wine here. But in terms of Chardonnay, I mean, as I'm sure many of you are aware, Australian Chardonnay as a whole has undergone a huge change over the last sort of 20, perhaps 30 years. You know, back in the 80s and 90s, Australian Chardonnay as a whole tended to be lots of oak, lots of malolactic fermentation, lots of fruit, you know, big, quite over the top styles of Chardonnay. And for many parts of Australia, there's been this real swing away from that since then towards much more vibrant, high acid, picking a bit earlier, reducing the amount of oak, reducing the amount of malolactic fermentation, giving much more elegant, drinkable styles of Chardonnay, to be honest. Now, the interesting thing about Margaret River is that it never really was made in that big over-the-top intense style. And so the style of Margaret River Chardonnay, although it has changed somewhat, hasn't seen this huge shift as other parts of Australia have. And I think that's in part because of the gingin clone. So because gingin clone always gives this lovely concentration of fruit, but high acid style, that's something the winemakers have always made. And, you know, the amount of oak may have changed somewhat, but actually Margaret River Chardonnay, gingin Chardonnay, can soak up a lot of new oak. You know, I was tasting recently, I think it was Vas Felix Heytesbury, so the top Chardonnay coming out of Vas Felix, and it was something like 60 or 80% new oak, so a lot of new oak. But tasting it, you had no idea there was that much new oak on there, because the gingin clone and the amount of fruit this clone gives just soaks up all that oak. It's really quite incredible. So, you know, so basically what I'm trying to say is Margaret River Chardonnay hasn't massively changed in terms of style, in terms of oak use, not like some other parts of Australia may have done. Mark, is Franklin River Syrah anything like Northern Rhone? Not dissimilar in some instances, to be honest. Yeah, I think you don't often get quite that real smoky bacony note in Franklin River that you'd often get in Northern Rhone, but it is very much made more in that style than, as I said, Barossa Shiraz style. So quite a different style of Shiraz, absolutely. Jude, is the Great Southern region one to watch? Do you expect to see significant growth in the region? Good question. One to watch, absolutely. I think we're seeing more and more wines from that region exported into different export markets. So, you know, these wines are becoming more available than perhaps they were 10, 15 years ago. Do I expect to see significant growth? Probably not, to be honest. Some people are planting more vineyards, but it's not going in, you know, any huge quantity. So I'm not expecting that total vineyard area figure to change dramatically within Great Southern. But I think it's that just continuing story of the producers and the winemakers really beginning to understand it as a region, as I said, what the soil types are, how that's affecting the different grape varieties. Perhaps we'll see more in terms of different alternative grape varieties planted in the region, because I think that sort of drive for experimentation is very strong in Australia, but I wouldn't expect to see a huge amount of new vineyard area going on in the region. Perhaps for no other reason than reason that it's so isolated as a region. They just don't have the labour force there. You know, as I said, it's 5 hours away from Perth, being the major nearby city. So it's not like there's a huge labour force on hand to suddenly help plant and then work, you know, any huge increased vineyard. Let's see, Alex, can you comment on domestic versus export for Great Southern and Margaret River wines? Good question. I don't have the exact figures to hand, though you would certainly be able to find out if you go on the Wine Australia website. I know certainly in Margaret River, cellar door sales are really important. They get a lot of tourists over there, and that's not just obviously domestic tourism, but also international tourism. It's, you know, Perth itself has become such a hub for international flights. You know, a lot of people are heading down to Margaret River, but exports are absolutely really important for the region. As I said, you know, Perth is 3 hours drive away. That's basically the only really major city within any sort of driving distance. So the local population is relatively small. So exports are always going to be very important for the region. Teresa, can I touch on the Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon tasting profiles a bit in both regions? Absolutely. And to be honest, there's probably not a huge difference between the regions, because typically the Sem Sauv, or, you know, the Sauv Sem blends are made in this kind of fresh, fruity, vibrant, aromatic style. You know, some producers will absolutely be doing a little bit of barrel aging or a bit of lees work to add extra body and weight. But typically these are made as, you know, early drinking, really fresh and vibrant styles to have, you know, either just an aperitif or alongside some seafood. And I think that's probably true across both those regions. Liam, has there been, oh, hi, Liam. Has there been any noticeable climate change in Western Australia? If so, how are they dealing with it? Good question. I'm trying to think. To be honest, the last, well, few 10 plus vintages in Margaret River have all been beautiful. And I know that sounds crazy to say, but Margaret River is absolutely blessed as a region with its climate. And that is because of this ocean influence and that real moderating influence of these two oceans. It doesn't have the same kind of heat spikes or temperature spikes as other regions in Australia have had to deal with. I think if anything, the one change perhaps people would talk about is an increase in dry summers. Summers are always pretty dry in Margaret River, but there seems to be less rainfall through the summer than there may have been in the past. And of course, that will start impacting viticulture, and perhaps people are having to irrigate a little bit where they wouldn't have done in the past. But I don't think there's this bigger overall change in terms of picking dates or vintage dates because of climate change that perhaps we are seeing in other parts of the world. Paul, where were the two clones in Margaret River developed? Well, they sort of weren't really developed. So both clones came into Western Australia to small vineyards, and basically were then that's what the vineyard the vine stock was when these first vineyards were planted in Margaret River. So Gin came in originally through California. So it was a clone coming out of California, and there's evidence to show that originally that clone actually came from Merceau. So it went from Merceau to California, eventually across to Western Australia, and then has sort of settled in Margaret River and is called Gin because there's a town just north of Perth called Gin, which is where this clone or these cuttings of those vines were originally sourced from. And the Horton clone, again, some of it is hard to pin down, but it's believed that clone originally came from Bordeaux, but probably into New South Wales back in the 1830s, and then came across to Western Australia. And again, it was sourced from the Horton vineyard, which is now why it's called the Horton clone. So it's fascinating that sort of to see how these clones have ended up in the region. And some of that genetic heritage and genetic history that we see in Margaret River. Graham, looking at these regions on the maps, the terrain seems relatively consistent. Does the terroir make as much difference in these regions? So I think when it comes to those maps, they're on a pretty small scale. So it's hard to really show those differences in topography. If you're looking at Margaret River, so there is a line of a ridge, essentially a ridge that runs north-south down the region, gives some altitude. Not huge amounts, we're only talking up to about 100 meters. But the important point about that ridge is that any vineyards on the eastern side of the ridge are very much warmer because they're protected from that cold southwesterly wind I was talking about. So that's giving that absolute difference in terroir because of that difference in altitude. And then from Great Southern, there really is some differences in altitude. Mount Barker and Parongarup have some altitude and elevation, as I was talking about. And then Franklin River is that sort of more elevated plateau. But I think because these regions are so big in terms of their scale, you just don't really see that differences on a little map like that. So it's quite hard to pick out. But there absolutely are differences. Amy, have sweet wines ever been an important wine style to these regions? The honest answer in terms of actual production, no. There is a little bit of sweet wine. I've certainly had some coming out of Margaret River, but it's all made in tiny, tiny, tiny volumes. It's never been a style that's been particularly important to these regions. No, they've absolutely always been concentrating on these still styles of wine. Okay, I think I've covered all those questions. Was there any other burning questions out there? Oh, Alex, who's my favorite producer? Oh, that's like asking me to choose my favorite child. Really tricky. I mean, many favourite producers in Margaret River, Vas Felix, absolutely, Cullen, Mosswood, Voyager Estate. I mean, the joy with both of these two regions is that the vast majority of wineries are still small, family-owned boutique wineries making high-end quality wines. So you really can't go too far wrong in either of these regions, which is great. And then in terms of Great Southern, some favourite producers, Plan B, they make some lovely wines, and they've just started a new label called The Next 100 Years. Their Syrah I tasted recently and it was really impressed by some beautiful wines. And then a number of Riesling producers, Harewood Estate comes to mind. Larry Cherubino, really pretty famous winemaker, making some really beautiful wines in Great Southern and also in Margaret River, actually. So yeah, lots of great wineries, certainly a lot to seek out and taste. Frank, is the harvesting in Margaret River primarily machine or hand? Good question, and I honestly don't know the answer to that. I'm sure both happen, but I couldn't tell you which is more or less likely. I really don't know, I'm sorry. Chris, what's the aging potential for the wines, specifically the whites? So if you're talking about those Sauv blends, I mean, really, for many producers, these are wines that are made to be drunk within a few years of vintage. As I said, these are made in that lovely, beautiful, bright, fresh, aromatic style, made for early drinking. Chardonnay, on the other hand, Margaret River Chardonnay can age for a very long time because it has that intensity, that fruit concentration, that beautiful acid backbone. You know, these are styles of Chardonnay that will age decades quite easily. So absolutely something to chuck in the cellar and try to keep your hands off if you can manage it. Okay, I think that might be the end of the questions. So just again to note our education website, if you want to take note of that. And then just to mention upcoming events. So I'm going to be doing a tasting at WSET School London on the 24th of June, looking at alternative Australia. So we'll be tasting a lot of alternative grape varieties, which I'm very excited about. And then the next in this webinar series, the Discover Australia session, will be on the 2nd of July. And we'll be looking at some of the regions from New South Wales, so covering Hunter Valley, Orange, and the Canberra district region. So I hope you can, many of you can join us for that session. Thank you so much for joining this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure talking about these two regions, and I hope to see you at the next session. Thank you.